in Chicago, Lincoln Park, she tells me. She went to high school at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, graduating in 2005. She then earned a master's degree in international relations at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and a master's in law at the University of London. Now, in late 2014, let's get the calendar straight here because it's going to be important. Late 2014, a year short of completing a doctoral degree in diplomacy, she decided to join Cambridge Analytica in London. We'll get to that in a moment. First, I want you to know that Brittany had worked previously on the campaigns of several Democratic candidates here in the U.S., including the presidential campaign of Barack Obama in 2007 and 2008. Now, during much of that stretch, she was working on the campaign from Hong Kong while she was on a college exchange from Edinburgh. Brittany has developed IT for a variety of social and diplomatic programs in Belgium, Switzerland, South Africa, India, Boston, London, New York, and right here in Chicago. This week alone, she flew from San Juan, where she helped implement federal funding to develop blockchain in Puerto Rico, back home to New York to meet with blockchain clients, then jetted off to LA to meet with more clients, and she plans to relocate to LA soon from New York. So, as I said, she just arrived 10 minutes ago, so I've been letting her catch her breath here. Last year, Brittany co-founded Bueno Capital in Switzerland to develop token ecosystems, and we'll talk about that. Early this year, she co-founded DATA, the Digital Asset Trade Association, to focus on reforming U.S. laws on the use of personal data and on using tokens in blockchain. So we're going to talk about the convergence of data issues, security, privacy, and blockchain. So, Brittany, I want to start off. I've given your amazing resume, and at this stage in life, your life, I can hardly believe all the things you've done and accomplished. But how and why did you come to join Cambridge Analytica in December of 2014?
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you everyone for being here. Firstly, let me say I am so happy to be in my hometown. This is the first time I've spoken at a conference in Chicago, and I speak at sometimes 3 and 4 conferences a week all around the world, usually in blockchain and data focus, and it's an absolute pleasure as well to be on the stage with someone with such an interesting, colorful, and illustrious history as Brian. So thank you guys for your time, and thank you for agreeing to do this with me. I'm really excited about this conversation we're about to have. So to address your question, I joined a company actually that was called the Strategic Communication Laboratories, the SCL Group, which is the parent company of what is a much more popular brand name these days, Cambridge Analytica. So I had heard around town that the SCL Group was one of the top companies around that was using data-driven communications in order to scientifically validate impact from campaigns. So I don't know how many of you guys have worked in political campaigning, charity campaigning, nonprofits, maybe I can get a hand, or even data-driven marketing. As you know, in a lot of traditional campaigning, it's very difficult to measure your impact. It was only recently when, I say recently because I mean really the past 5 to 10 years, that we've started to be able to quantify when you're running large-scale communications or even localized communications, that what you're doing is having a real effect, that you're actually reaching people, people are listening, and that you're creating change. Now, I had been working in campaigning for my entire life, and I would say adult life, but I really started in campaigns when I was around 14, 15 years old.
Me too.
Exactly. I was really driven during this one trip that I took while I was in high school. One of my friend's older sisters was working on Howard Dean's primary campaign for president. I took a bus up to New Hampshire and got to see Howard Dean make a speech, and I was so driven and so inspired to do whatever I could to get involved. So I started volunteering on Howard Dean's campaign, doing calls and emails to undecided voters, and anything that I could do. If on weekends I was allowed to go and knock on doors, I would do that. When the nominee became John Kerry, I did the same for him. Now, during this campaign cycle, I was lucky enough to meet our former president, Barack Obama, when he was just a state senator. He was speaking here, not too far from where we are right now, about programs that were being run by British Petroleum that were going to cause huge dumps into the streams and waterways feeding into Lake Michigan. Now, I was a huge environmental activist at the time in terms of how much can you do when you're, 15 years old, but I was really upset by this. These were loopholes that the Bush administration had created. Formerly, you were not allowed to dump into any of the streams or waterways that led into the Great Lakes or the Great Lakes themselves. So State Senator Barack Obama was talking about how him and Senator Dick Durbin were going to stop and block British Petroleum from being able to do this. I thought he was one of the most incredible orators I had ever met in my life. I think most of you would probably agree, whether you met him or not, that those skills are definitely inspiring every time you hear him speak. And I was so lucky that there were only 30 people there. So I waited till he got off the stage and got to speak with him and told him, what could I do to help? He said, first, you should volunteer for Environment Illinois. This is the U.S. Public Interest Research Group is helping run these campaigns to make sure we can actually block BP from these dumps. And I think I'm going to run for U.S. Senate. Maybe you want to volunteer on my campaign. Of course, I said yes. That led to quite a long, many years of following Barack Obama through his U.S. senatorial career and me waiting for the day that he would finally announce that he was going to run for president. Now, in between him starting his presidential campaign and the time where I first met him, I took part in a program at the 2004 DNC. That program was made to teach young people how you could run a presidential campaign. I actually have one of my friends here who was on this program with me. So they taught us how to run a campaign by having us run a mock campaign. Hilariously, I ran for president. I believe Ben and I spent some time making posters saying, "Be wiser, vote Kaiser," and putting them up around Boston. I also went to another talk that then Senator Barack Obama was giving. Again, it was an environmental rally in Boston Harbor, and I went to go hear about the initiatives he was working on. Afterwards, he invited me to an Illinois State breakfast, and I got to have breakfast with him, Rahm Emanuel, and Jan Schakowsky, and he said, after breakfast, by the way, this evening I'm giving a speech. I think you guys might know which speech I'm about to talk about. He said, Jan, get her some tickets. So that evening, I got to go into the big stadium where John Kerry was being endorsed for the Democratic Party nominee that evening. And Barack gave his incredibly famous speech, the first time that everybody in the country started to focus on him as a potential presidential candidate, where he said, we are not blue states and red states. We are the United States of America. Now, that's something that still rings very true to me these days when we have such division in our country politically, and that'll start to catch up a little bit later. So I eventually ended up leaving the University of Edinburgh as soon as Barack Obama announced that he was going to run for president. My professors asked me why I was going to take a leave of absence, and I said I'm going to work on the presidential campaign in the United States. So excited. And they go, oh yes, you're going to go work for Hillary Clinton. I was like, no, my senator, Barack Obama? They just blank stares. They had no idea who that was. And they suggested if I wasn't going to go work for Hillary that I should probably remain at university because I would no longer be able to get a good grade that year if I left before my exams and before my final essays were due. I decided not to listen and moved back here to Chicago to work at headquarters and proceeded to be, I think, the 5th or 6th member of the new media team. The new media team in 2007 at Obama HQ, we were a young group of very excited technologists that were, for the first time, looking to measure our impact in campaigning. I don't know how many of you guys are up to date on your political data strategy, but our new media team was the first time that social media was ever used in campaigns. Facebook and Twitter wasn't being used yet. We still had MySpace groups for Obama. And these social media tools were, for the first time, used to actually undertake outreach. Nothing commercial or political had ever been done. And this is the first time that I started to learn about data and how you could use data in order to engage people, in order to figure out what people actually cared about, in order to make sure that when you're talking to people that you're actually going to have an impact. Now, this is where I really actually get to answer your question, and I know that was a long-winded explanation.
I knew you were getting there.
But a couple years later, I started my PhD. Now, I spent quite a few years in law school studying human rights law, genocide prevention, crimes against humanity prevention. I spent most of my childhood here at a Jewish school, really concentrating on how we could make sure that things like the Holocaust never happened again. So that was my specialty, and I started my PhD diving deep into how we could prevent violent crime and large-scale wartime conflicts from occurring. And it all drew back to, we do not have enough data analyzed properly and given to people of power that make decisions in a real-time enough basis in order to prevent things. It's always too little, too late. So what are the mechanisms that we have for collecting data around the world? How are we analyzing this data that we're getting? What are these data points actually telling us? And how quickly are we getting it into the hands of, say, President Obama so that he can call Assad on time and tell him that he's hit a red line? So I wanted to work at the SCL group because they were known for being the best in the business on this. SCL Defense was known for being very successful in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics trafficking, and countering violent government propaganda in other parts of the world. And I thought, hey, this is exactly what I need to learn about in order to really complete my PhD, not as an academic, but as somebody that can go out into the world and actually make a change. So quite a lot different than most people would probably assume. That's how I ended up at Cambridge Analytica.
And what projects did you work on in London? And what surprised you being on the inside and seeing how data was being used?
Well, again, this was the first time that I really understood at this type of scale, especially outside of the United States, how data was being used by governments, international organizations, and companies. I came in, and the first project I actually worked on was how can we use data-driven communications to get people to understand the impact of Ebola in the Ebola-stricken countries. And I was working with the WHO in order to put together roundtables in Geneva to discover how could we use data and communications to get people to re-engage in these countries and help with post-conflict reconstruction. Now, obviously, as a political animal myself, I was excited to get the chance to do something like David Axelrod did after the Obama campaign and go and consult on political campaigns around the world. So I started working on elections in Europe, Africa, and Asia, helping governments and political parties understand how you could use data. Now, there are some governments and political parties around the world that have more sophisticated data-driven communications in politics, similar to the United States, for instance, the Philippines. But really most countries around the world have less data available. Less internet penetration is one of the main reasons. And they don't have sophisticated, advanced analytics that are using modeling to understand what people care about. How do you talk to individuals? Who is it that you need to talk to as a political party to actually get supporters, to get people to show up to vote and register in the first place? Now, those types of programs are so exciting for me. I mean, being able to talk to, for instance, a politician in Lithuania that never thought about the fact that you could use, that you could send out volunteers with their cell phone that could go door to door and collect data about what people cared about so that your platform was actually more useful and interesting for people was mind-blowing and so inspiring, actually.
So during those early days with the company, SCL in London, How did your bosses describe to you what they saw as the state of the data collection world at that time?
Now, this is very interesting. My former CEO, Alexander Nix, would talk about data and the data landscape as the Wild West. And to be fair to him, in the United States, it still is in terms of our lack of adequate legislation and regulation. But really also in many other places around the world, laws have not caught up with technology. So when he said the Wild West, he really meant now's the time that if we want to build a large-scale business in markets all around the world, we can still purchase and license and collect data and store it and model it mostly without anybody's permission. These data sets are commercially available, or they're open source from the government or the United Nations, and the matching and modeling and usage of this data for communications is vastly unregulated. So now's the time, before the regulatory environment catches up with the technology, to go in and collect as much data as possible and build.
I want to check, can you all hear us okay? Everybody's okay? Okay, good. So, you were in London from December of 2014, and then in May of 2015, was it Alexander who asked if you would go to Washington and open an office there for Cambridge Analytica?
That's correct, yes.
And what did you do in Washington then?
So my first trip to Washington with Alexander, as you said, was in May 2015 to start to look at how we could open an office in Washington, D.C. to prepare for the next election cycle. The company already had a lot of clients in the United States, from presidential level to senatorial, congressional races, super PACs, PACs, interest groups. And so it was quite important that we now start to build out a local presence, as opposed to just flying in a couple people in and out every now and again. And so we started looking at office space, but for the first few months I was going back and forth to DC, our office was actually a place called the Embassy, which is on Capitol Hill. It's Steve Bannon's house, and there's a Breitbart office in the basement.
And he was already involved with Cambridge Analytica at that point.
Yes, he was one of the founding board members.
So you arrived in Washington May of 2015. It's important for us all to remember that Donald Trump did not announce his candidacy until July of 2015. And by that fall, you were working on the Ted Cruz campaign. Is that correct?
Cambridge Analytica was. Everybody in the company knew what my political leanings were, and they used to laugh and call me the Democrat spy. So I was never put on operations on any of the campaigns, but I did do coordination with the heads of campaigns, funders, campaign managers, heads of PACs, and I largely just played a business development role, but wouldn't be in day-to-day work.
So, for instance, you worked with Kellyanne Conway, who was then with the Ted Cruz campaign.
That's correct. I saw her quite often in my meetings, and she was in charge of the PAC called Keep the Promise, which was Ted Cruz's first super PAC. She runs a company called the Polling Company. It's an the only all-female polling company, which is quite cool. And so we worked with her on designing the qualitative and quantitative research programs that would go into our sampling for our political models.
And you indicated to me that Cambridge did not become involved in the Trump campaign until the point when Ted Cruz essentially accepted that he was not going to get the nomination. He really didn't give up completely until the convention, but there was no overlap or conflict of interest for Cambridge in working with the Cruz and Trump campaigns, correct?
Well, this is kind of funny actually, but when I first kind of was briefed into what the U.S. side of the SCL group was doing, which is Cambridge Analytica, I learned about quite a lot of the candidates, and I never really thought, nor did a lot of other people in the office, that any of these people would ever have the chance to become president. So we negotiated with Ted Cruz that we would have no non-compete in the contract, meaning that we could work for as many presidential candidates on the Republican side as we wanted to. And I did pitch almost all of them. Everyone from Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush came out to see us in London, to Chris Christie and Rick Perry, and I mean, everybody. The first time I pitched the Trump campaign was actually in September 2015, when I went to go see Corey Lewandowski in Trump Tower in New York, which was one of the weirdest meetings I've ever had in my life. I came up, I'd never been to Trump Tower before, and I came up to whatever the floor was, and I walked out, and for some reason the room I walked into looked very familiar. So I casually said, "Oh, Corey, this is so strange. I've never been here before, but it looks very familiar." And he goes, "Of course it does. You've seen The Apprentice, haven't you?" It's like, "Excuse me?" He goes, "Oh, this is the set of The Apprentice." And I thought in my head, are you telling me that Donald Trump's campaign HQ is a reality TV set? Is this for real?
And you thought we're not in Kansas anymore, Jonah.
Yeah, exactly. I was shocked. It was this empty TV set that just had "Make America Great Again" posters all over the wall, and no people in it. No people. There was Corey, a political director, and someone where her title said Director of Communications, but at the time I was like 26 years old, and she looked half my age. So I was kind of confused about what was going on, considering most campaign HQs I've been into are really wild, packed, bustling places where people are running around like madness, trying to get things done, 24/7. So I had no idea where all the staffers were. It seemed that there weren't any.
Looking back, does it make sense now, given how much emphasis the Trump campaign put on not only his rallies and his personal appearances, but the data operation in San Antonio?
Yeah, well, it took us a while to convince that campaign that data was important. Mr. Trump was going on TV and saying how Ted Cruz had it all wrong because data wasn't actually useful. And we were shocked, and we were like, okay, well, if you become the nominee, you're really going to change your tune rather quickly, because Hillary Clinton has about 10,000 people working for her. And if you're not going to use data, there's going to be no chance that this is ever going to happen. So it wasn't until he became the nominee where he started to listen to us that data science is important. And if you want to run a campaign, especially against the most qualified candidate in all of history, then you are going to have to build up a data program. And that ended up being what Cambridge Analytica did for the campaign.
So how would you describe your involvement with the Trump campaign, if at all, in any form?
I didn't have any involvement past that first pitch and some negotiations, which didn't go anywhere because Ted Cruz actually became popular enough to win quite a few primaries, and the Trump campaign wasn't interested in us running his only real rival's campaign as well as his. So when we finally, I mean Cambridge Analytica, when the company started running building and running a new data program under Brad Parscale in San Antonio, I was off doing other things. I was back doing global rest of the world, as we called it, ROW, political campaigns from Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and also building up our commercial offering. I actually ended up moving to New York, which allowed me to see a lot of really interesting meetings coming through our boardroom, which was only a couple blocks from Trump Tower, but I wasn't meant to be privy to any of that, especially in a business development role. I don't know how many people here are briefed on FEC guidelines, but if you're going to be talking to a super PAC and a campaign, you're not allowed to hear anything about strategy or day-to-day operations. You can only really talk about at a 10,000-foot level what might be needed, so that I could still stay in communication with, people like Kellyanne and Steve, as well as people who are running super PACs.
When did you leave SCL or Cambridge Analytica, and can you tell us why?
So I left officially January 31st of this year to work in blockchain full time. I had spent about a year telling my former CEO, Alexander Nix, that blockchain was the most important thing to me, and it should be the most important thing to a data science company. And that we should start training our data scientists how to be blockchain engineers. We should start building ARB bots. We should start building trading platforms. And he told me to stop talking about blockchain. So I just stopped talking about it to him. And on the side of working for Cambridge Analytica, I started to build my own blockchain advisory, which as soon as he realized that we were at Davos during the World Economic Forum and he was speaking in what he realized was my blockchain conference at Davos called Crypto HQ, I had offered him a speaking position at this conference without mentioning that I was actually the organizer. When he realized that, we came to a little bit of a disagreement on how I was spending my time, and we decided to go separate ways.
So you were essentially with SCL for 3 years and 2 months. At any point during that, did you become troubled about the way the company was collecting data, using data? How did your attitude about what was being done change over that 3-year span?
So throughout my time at the company, I was always really excited about what we were building. In the United States, I spent a lot more time building data-driven advertising infrastructure than I did on the political side. Again, because of my political leanings and the clients, I was never 100% involved on the US political side, except for pitching in the very beginning. And I was led to believe, and it still might be true, that's up for authorities and governments to decide, that everything was done by the book. That we had the lawyers in place that were making sure that everything was going according to plan and according to the law and according to regulations in all of the places that we were working in. Now, the main thing that's a little bit troubling, actually, is that no matter if that was true, if everything was done according to the law, what you can do with data and personal data in this country that is legal is actually quite shocking. And that's one of the main reasons why I came out as a whistleblower. When I figured out that everybody was so upset about some of the things that were being done with data, and that actually nobody realized the situation that they were in. As an individual in the United States, you are pre-opted in. So because you are in the United States, because you are born here, you live here, you do business here, you have a credit card, you have a bank account, you live your day-to-day life, you have a cell phone, it means you have consented to your data being collected and modeled and used to target you without your opt-in. And I'm not talking about, yes, some platforms you have terms and conditions where you click a box and you never read them, but I mean your personal data, like where you live and your phone number and your full name and your credit file and your consumer and lifestyle data and your political data, that is all purchased and licensed without you even clicking a single box. And that can be purchased and licensed by anybody in the world, which I think has been one of the biggest revelations of this whole data crisis. You don't have to be an American company. You can purchase it from France. You can purchase it from Nigeria. You can purchase it from Russia.
So the news outlets started coming after you in March of this year, and this was after the former director of data research for Cambridge Analytica, a Canadian named Christopher Wiley, who left Cambridge in 2014 before you came aboard. He revealed how Cambridge Analytica had mined data from at least 50 million Facebook users. How was it that the media came after you, and how did you get involved, and what did you say?
Well, so I had no idea that the Facebook data that we had at Cambridge Analytica, well, that we weren't meant to have it. I had absolutely no idea. I mean, I gave presentations every day of this is what's in our database, all of these different things, and we have data on, 30 million Facebook users, which then, as Chris Wiley said to The Guardian, through the Friends API, that actually means that's 87 million people, because Mark Zuckerberg's company allowed people that did not opt into their data being taken to be taken through their friendship network. So although this wasn't the biggest shock in the world to me, it was the first time that I thought, it's really easy for companies, even a small company like Cambridge Analytica that is under the microscope of every agency in the country and every regulatory body all around the world for the work that we do famously, that a company like that can still get away with something like that. And if it's legal, how many other companies around the country and around the world are doing something similar or even much bigger? We were a small company, not worth that much, with less than 120 people working full time. What about all of the biggest corporations around the world? What about governments? It seems quite easy when you don't have technology that allows you to track and trace where data goes for these types of data crises to occur.
You had already established, when you learned all this and the media started contacting you, you had already established the Digital Asset Trade Association. Mm-hmm. How did this experience and suddenly being in the limelight, in the spotlight on this, how did it deepen your resolve to push for regulations on the use of personal data?
Well, I had already been working for many years on different platforms, both off blockchain and on blockchain, that had to do with data security, letting people own their own data, monetize their own data. Starting in 2013, with some of my friends and I built an app called Tagly in order to stop fake news. At the time, there was a huge proliferation of images that had been taken by citizen journalists that were being repurposed. So an old, a new picture that was taken in Tahrir Square would be reported somewhere else as saying, oh, look at what just happened in Iraq. Everything is flaring up again. And this was a huge problem. So our app was made for citizen journalists. I co-founded it with one of my friends, Tim Poole, who invented citizen journalism by being the first person to use live stream when covering Occupy Wall Street, and then founded Vice Live News. And he started using this in the field. Many different news agencies around the world started using this app in the field, where it encrypted in the metadata of your photo where this was taken, when this was taken, your social media handle, and even a watermark on it if you wanted, to make sure that your data, your content, could not be repurposed and that you could use it for your own monetary benefit if you wanted to, or at least be able to authenticate that to news agencies. Fast forward a little bit, with some of those co-founders, I started working on an app called Piggy, which puts tokens in your piggy bank to reward you for the data that you share, and it shows you targeted content. And those tokens pay for, those piggy coins in your piggy bank pay for your airtime. The whole idea is, you produce so much value every single day, your data, your time, your attention, the value you produce as a human being means that you should have connectivity for free every day, always. Because that's your value, that's your data. So I had been speaking at conferences and private events for a long time on these topics already, when it came to Restart Week in Puerto Rico, where I was speaking at some conferences called Blockchain Unbound and Coin Agenda, and that's when the first whistleblower came out. And I'm there speaking about people owning their data while my company that everybody, my former company that everybody associates me with at the time, is all over the news for not letting people own their data or know where their data has gone. And that was quite a shock, as you can imagine. As you asked about the Digital Asset Trade Association, DATA, which was, it's a lobbying organization that I helped co-found. The month before that, I had found out that there were 2 bills that had been put in the Wyoming State Congress. Now, these are the first 2 bills of what I call blockchain positive legislation. So as opposed to the one negative law that we had in New York at the time, these were the first laws that were to protect blockchain entrepreneurship, to explain what a digital asset is, to define a token, to define a utility token against the wishes of the SEC, and to start to protect an industry that had vastly started to leave America behind. You know, I'm only an American, and I have had to help people as a blockchain advisor start companies in jurisdictions all around the world because I couldn't comfortably tell my clients and my colleagues that if you establish your company in the United States of America, it's not going to get taken away from you. That you're not going to get an SEC subpoena in your mailbox, right? So I saw that these two laws called HB 19 and HB 70 put into the Wyoming Congress, and I thought, oh my God, this is our shot. We've got to get them passed. And I gathered as many people as I possibly could in the blockchain space with the help of my friend Brock Pierce, who obviously is one of the leaders in the space. And he helped me find everybody that he knew that had a lobbying background, a legislative background, campaigning. And we brought those people together and put them on planes to Cheyenne. And we showed up in Cheyenne and we sat there in the Senate and we met with every single senator. And we explained to them, what is blockchain? What is this going to bring to your economy? What does this technology do for industries? Why should you vote yes to this legislation? And how is the state of Wyoming going to benefit? Now,
and Wyoming is the only state that has passed this kind of legislation, correct?
The only one that has passed this comprehensive legislation. We started a huge kind of domino effect throughout the United States, and there's quite a few other states that have either passed one or two laws or now have legislation that's sitting in Congress for vote. But in Wyoming, we managed to get 5 bills passed, all 5 that we put in, almost unanimously.
And we don't usually think of Wyoming as the tech center of the U.S., right?
No, but what is so great about the state of Wyoming are that the legislators are all volunteers. So they are cattle ranchers, they are professors, they are lawyers, and they understand when you explain to them what blockchain does to benefit their industries, what that actually means. They're not there just as civil servants, so they come in and they volunteer for, they come into state legislature and vote on the bills that are in that session, and then they go back to their regular jobs. So everybody there is so open-minded, really understanding, and now I think they all call themselves the blockchain cowboys, which is absolutely fantastic. And we even managed to get a government technology budget in the state instead of given to a random IT company, for them to give a budget that they were going to do for tracking their cattle. Cattle ranching is one of Wyoming's biggest exports, and the beef that comes from Wyoming is more expensive than other states. And they constantly have problems with other states labeling their beef as Wyoming beef and therefore getting more money in the market for it and diminishing the returns that cattle ranchers in Wyoming can get for their amazing product. So they gave gave 2 of my colleagues that were there with me lobbying a start to that budget, and they started beefchain.io. A couple months ago, I think 2 months ago, they were on the front page of Forbes for them tagging all of the cattle with RFID chips that put that data on the blockchain for the first time.
Fantastic. Now, I want everybody to be thinking about questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then I want to open it up for your questions. And the question I have, how does blockchain fit into your effort to protect our personal information?
So there's quite a few different reasons why blockchain is the only available technology at the moment that we can start to trust and trial for solving a lot of the problems that have come out of this data crisis. First of all, transparency and tracking. Where is the data that you have produced and where is it going? That was one of the main issues where if Facebook would have had a blockchain ecosystem when they had the Friends Data API, they could have tracked the probably tens of thousands of companies that have used this API, where those data sets went, where they were stored, where they were sent to. And then it would have been quite easy to do just a little bit of due diligence for a company that, before I got involved, was worth $500 billion, but I think it's around 380 right now. They could have spent a little bit of money on due diligence, but there's not really a reliable technology to do that. Where are data sets going? How many copies do you make? We don't have an infrastructure for doing that. So tracking and traceability is one thing. Next would obviously be opt-in and consent. I think consent is a word that really rings true with a lot of people because it means a lot of things with a lot of different concepts. But the concept of consent, that you would actually say, yes, I understand what I'm consenting to, is a little bit skewed in data laws. So if you just click the box of T's and C's but you never read them, you have consented. If you are just in America for most of your data sets, you have consented to that data being collected. But in blockchain and distributed ledger technology, we have a very exciting thing for someone like me that comes from a legal background called a smart contract, where we can actually put together a contract that self-executes, where you can say, I'm going to license my data for these purposes, and when you are done using it for those purposes, then you no longer have access to that data. And that can be encoded now in a smart contract. So when you are clicking T's and C's, you can go a little bit more in depth and say, okay, I am only going to let you use my data and store it in these places for this long, and you can only use it to advertise products to me. You can't use it to advertise political ideology to me, right? Depending on what you want.
And that's one of the things that had bothered you before, isn't it? That data, after it was used, was not deleted? Well, it stuck around, and it could be reused many other times for purposes that maybe the providers of that data had not even originally considered.
Of course. Well, I'm sorry to say it, whether Cambridge Analytica kept that Facebook data set or not, there are tens of thousands of other companies that had that same data set. And is anyone coming after them? Are there any other databases being subpoenaed? Where is everybody's data that has been on Facebook since April 2015 and before that? We can never get our privacy back. That data is not able to be deleted. There are so many copies of that around the world that I'm only talking about the data we produce from here forward. I'm talking about data security for our children and grandchildren. We will never get it back. And that's the harsh reality. So we need to start testing as many technologies as possible to start to solve these problems now that people are actually listening and we have a bit of momentum. And the campaign that I started after this whole data crisis, called Own Your Data, addresses my next point besides tracking and traceability and opt-in infrastructure, which is monetization of your own data. The companies in the world that are worth the most amount of money, trillions and trillions of dollars, are actually just made up of our digital assets. What is valuable about Facebook, Google, Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft? It's our data. Those trillions and trillions of dollars that those companies have are just because they've managed to collect our data in so many creative ways and managed to build so many models out of it to sell things back to us, that's all that is. It's a technology for collecting more of our data and monetizing it. And we don't get anything besides an email account or a login to a social network. That's all we get. And I think that is the most important point, and the reason why I worked on something called the Siglo protocol, where Piggy is the first app that's going to be on it. How are you going to monetize your own data, the assets that you produce every day? That's your own human value. Just because someone invented a new and interesting way to collect your data from you doesn't mean that they should fully own that. In Europe, actually, your data is your property, which is why the legislation is very specific about how you have to opt in and agree to how your data is being used. In the United States, that's not true yet. Luckily, Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts has introduced something called the consent bill, where at minimum, we will have to consent to the way that our data is held and used. But that's really only the tip of the iceberg, because that doesn't allow our data to be our property, and it doesn't allow us to start to monetize that. Although I'm really excited that Facebook actually has a real blockchain team, and hopefully they can start to think about giving us Facebook tokens for all that data that they take and use from us every day.
I have so many more questions. I love Brittany's passion, but I want to open it up. I'm getting the wrap sign over here, but I hope they'll allow us to take a few questions. Yes, sir.
Amazing. How can you support the lobby? So there's quite a few different things going on, but I would say the Digital Asset Trade Association, or DATA, as I so hilariously called it before all of this stuff happened, is probably my baby. If you go to digitalasset.org and you send in your information, we can tell you about all of the different state legislation that's coming up. Obviously, there are things that you can do in terms of spreading the word, getting calls and emails into your representatives to get those bills passed. And there are a lot of candidates that are very positive on these types of changes that we need to make in our government that are running for office in November. So as I think I said earlier, I'm a huge political animal, and trust me, no matter whether these candidates are independent, a random party, Republicans, Democrats, red, white, blue, doesn't matter. If they are interested in the changes that need to be made in our legislation to protect individuals and to protect citizens, they should be supported.
Last chance to get a question. Yes, sir. He asks, is it Brittany 2024 or 2028?
You're too kind. I prefer to promote other candidates. It's one of my favorite things. If anybody here has political ambitions, I can hook you up with the right back-end infrastructure for sure. But I take that as a huge compliment. You're too kind.
I had the same thought. I'm so impressed with Brittany's ability not only to understand laws and technology and the details involved, but also to understand the big picture. And I appreciate all of you being here to discuss that with us. And let's have a big hand for Brittany.
And a big hand for Brian.
Well, I only had to drive in from the burbs. She had to fly here from LA and run like crazy to get here. So thank you all for being here. Have a great evening. There is a pub crawl. Go on the app or the website or ask at the check-in desk. People will give you information about the social events tonight, and I hope many of you are coming back here tomorrow.
And I will definitely be at the social event, so if you didn't get to ask a question, I am around. Thanks, guys.
Woo!